Among other things, in my academic and scholarly career, I am a Saint Anselm scholar. That is, I am somebody who focuses on the works, the thought, the life, the importance, the influence of Saint Anselm of Canterbury, also known as Saint Anselm of Bec, Saint Anselm of Aosta, depending on where you are, because the English like to claim him as their own with Canterbury, the French like to claim him as their own through Bec, and the Italians like to claim him as their own through Aosta, three places that he spent portions of his life. This is, this development of becoming a St. Anselm scholar, which has been going on for me for over a decade, is not something I would have ever have predicted or let alone expected when I was early on in my philosophical career. I didn't really have much use for Christian thinkers to begin with when I was an undergraduate, other than Kierkegaard, and that was because of his emphasis on individuality. And even, a good ways into my graduate career, if you would have told me that, midway through my life, at the 40-year point, I would be working on a book on St. Anselm, and actually more than one book, but, got to get one done before you start talking about the others. I would have probably laughed at you and said, well, who do you think you're fooling? So I think the story about how I became a St. Anselm scholar and why I'm so interested in this guy, what I find so fruitful, it's an interesting story. It's a very idiosyncratic story, too. It's got its twists and turns that, again, would have been very difficult to predict and probably would not have worked as a path for many other people, but did for me because of my own predilections and my own weird areas of interest and my own quirks and my own narrative and history. And I have to say I'm very pleased about how things have gone along the way. And I also have to say that I have to be very grateful to many people for encouraging my interest in Anselm and for giving me the right nudges and the right pushes at the right times. Sometimes I took advantage of them, sometimes I didn't. And I like to think that St. Anselm himself has a role in that, not merely as a thinker, but as part of a larger community, as part of a communion. So what I'm going to talk about in this video is a little bit more structured than some of the other philosophical development videos. I am going to talk about Anselm's writings and what this guy actually did and who he was a little bit. I'm going to talk about my own timeline, which I managed to plot out of how I became an Anselm scholar, what were the key things. I'm going to talk about a particular place, and I've got some not video footage, but some pictures I'm going to show you and talk a little bit over it. A place that's been particularly important for me as an Anselm scholar, and I think is an important place in general for Anselm scholarship, and a place that I very much would love to see grow and become yet more fruitful and become a locus for Anselm scholarship, and for younger scholars coming up in the ranks to get their push and their pull the way I did from it. And that is the Institute for Saint Anselm Studies at St. Anselm's College in Manchester, New Hampshire. And I'll talk about that in a few minutes. And then I'll talk about what Anselm means to me in particular as not just a scholar, but a person. So St. Anselm has left us quite a body of work and writings, and it's interesting stuff. Most of it has been translated. A lot of it's been translated many times by multiple people. As a matter of fact, there's a new translation apparently of the Proslogion coming out with commentary through St. Augustine's Press. That's probably been his most translated work, I would say. And I'd like to talk a little bit about, just to give you an impression about what this guy did and the framework in which he did it, about his writings and sort of situate that in the framework of his life as a whole. And, you know, you can say, I think if there's one thing to say about Anselm as a thinker, a scholar, a writer, it's that he got his writing done despite being pulled off in multiple directions by many people at different points in his life. Yeah, that's probably the best way to put it. Because he's a guy who was, you know, very, very competent and also very saintly. Sometimes these clashed. Admer tells us a little bit about that in one of his stories in the life of Saint Anselm, which, by the way, is a great work to read if you want to know something about this guy, Anselm. It may come across as kind of hagiographical, you know, that is, you know, kind of hazy aura of sainthood about the guy. But really, there's a lot of prosaic incidents in there which are probably pretty accurate in representing who this guy was. We look at the other evidences that we have, and we know that Anselm himself looked over the stuff. Anselm had a scrupulous regard for truth, and didn't say that anything in it was particularly untruthful. So anyway, Anselm was a guy who early on decided that he had some sort of religious vocation, but wasn't quite sure what it was. And he came from a noble family in Aosta, which was in Burgundy at that time. Now it's part of Italy. And he fled across the Alps. There's a whole interesting story there. Went into France. At that time was, you know, split up into a whole bunch of different little kingdoms, and Normandy was an important part of it. And the Normans had recently conquered England. Anselm is a contemporary of all these great events that are taking place in the 11th century. So Anselm eventually settles down at Bec, becomes a monk, and then gets promoted to prior, which is the sort of second in command in a monastery, who handles a lot of the day-to-day business and also handled the education of the monks and perhaps of other people there at the monastery of Bec. It was a new monastery, and the abbot, Herluin, was not a sort of guy who would come up through the ranks of you know, the organization, so to speak. He was an old warrior who settled down and became a monk and then eventually became an abbot. When Herluin died, Anselm was elected really against his wishes to be abbot, and he tried to wiggle his way out of it, and he had to be told, no, you've been chosen, you're the guy for the job, and so he took it on, and he was a very good abbot, and he ran things very well, and that got him known over in England, where the Normans were consolidating their conquest. And because the Norman monastery of Bec had some little holdings here and there where Anselm would have to go out and see, how are the monks doing over here? And that brought him to the notice of the king, William Rufus, who decided, I'm going to make him archbishop. And there's a whole long story there that I'm not going to go into. Maybe I'll do a video on that some other time. In any case, Anselm was dragged, literally kicking and screaming, and installed as bishop. Tried to get out of that, couldn't do it, and finally agreed to it. And then not long after that, relations with the king started to break down. And Anselm was at the very heart of very tangled church-state relations, not only in England, but all across Europe. The Gregorian reforms were in place. There were a lot of problems within the church, as there always are at any given point in time. Anybody who thinks that, this is an aside, but anybody who thinks that, you know, there's a big scandal in the church or something like that, really they ought to study some church history, and that'll put things into perspective. And, you know, it's not to take away from the largeness of any one given scandal, but you'll realize that that's always what's going on. And it's not because, you know, oh, it's such a bad institution or something like that. It's because it's made up of human beings who are always 3/4 screwed up and, like, you know, 1/4 trying to do good. Anyway, Anselm was at the heart of that. And so he managed to get a lot of writing done during this time, and some of this writing is motivated by what he's going through, but a lot of it is motivated by his quest And we know this in part from some of his letters and correspondence with people, and we know this in part because of some of his prayers and meditations, and because of the life of Saint Anselm, what his actual motivations were. Why did he write? In some cases he wrote because the monks bugged him until he would write down some of the things that he was teaching orally. And sometimes he wrote because he wanted to communicate the pleasure that the thoughts that he had worked out and that he was meditating upon had communicated to him. Sometimes he wrote in order to provide pieces for meditation, practical meditation, to help people get their lives straight. That's what a lot of his prayers and meditations are actually intended to be. Sometimes he wrote because he saw an abuse that needed to be corrected. He saw a situation that was going to get out of hand that needed to be addressed. Sometimes he wrote because there was a theological problem that was actually put before the church. His writings on the incarnation of the Word, for example, are trying to combat some of the problematic interpretations coming out of dialectic that people were having of the Trinity. Or his letter on the procession of the Holy Spirit comes from the Council of Bari, where Anselm was one of the chief speakers on the part of the Western Church and its understanding of things, as opposed to the Eastern, the Orthodox Church. Probably one reason why Orthodox quite often have a very dim view of Anselm, by the way. Anyway, what did he write? So I've given you this long prologue. What did the guy write? Well, you can divide up his corpus into a number of different genres of writing. There's what we call the treatises, and these are kind of a mixed bag. They include the Monologion, the Proslogion, the On Truth, on freedom of choice, on the fall of the devil, why God became man, on the virgin conception, on the incarnation of the Word, on the concordance. There's a whole long title to that I'm going to sort of skip over. A lot of times people will put on the procession of the Holy Spirit in there as well. And there's also on the grammarian, which sometimes gets left out or ignored or downplayed. And then those are the ones that have been translated. There's also the De Similitudinibus, or On Similitudes, which is attributed to Anselm. And this is something kind of interesting to think about. There are a lot of works that are actually attributed to Anselm in Means Patrologia Latina. That's the sort of big compendium of all the Latin works of the church doctors and fathers and people like that. And Anselm got so famous that people would write stuff and then attribute it to him, even though he didn't write it, because that way they could get other people to read it. Now, the De Similitudinibus, what the scholars, scholars way up at the high level, think, like Southern and people like that, was that it contained portions which were perhaps not Anselmian, but the core of it was actually Anselmian. And so Southern reconstructed what he calls the De Humanibus Moribus, which is not translated yet. I'm working on a translation of it. And it's included in this Memorials of Saint Anselm, along with some other really, really cool works, like the Dicta Anselmi, literally the sayings of Saint Anselm, which are recorded by one of his fellow monks, Alexander, from Canterbury. And they're consistent with, and they expand upon Anselm's other teachings. So there's this whole body of treatises, and some of these are sort of in a meditative, argumentative form. Some of them are in dialogue form. Some of them are more straightforward treatises. So they've got varied, what you'd call genres to them. Anselm also wrote several meditations, that we think 3, and a number of prayers addressed to different some of them are addressed to Christ, or you know, to God on behalf of one's friends, to God on behalf of one's enemies. Three of them are addressed to Mary, and then there's a bunch of them that are addressed to figures that are particularly important in the gospel story, like St. John the Baptist, John the Evangelist, Mary Magdalene, Peter. Then there's one to St. Benedict, and there's also one to St. Nicholas. And these are really interesting bits of work. I shouldn't say bits. I mean, they are carefully constructed edifices with, you could think of them as sort of verbal constructions that you don't sort of mumble along, and just recite them. They're supposed to place you in this dramatic context in relation to the saint who is an intercessor with God. And they're supposed to help you know something about yourself. They're instruments of self-knowledge, of awakening the right sort of emotions and affections, and understanding your past, your present, your future. Brilliant stuff. So he wrote a lot of those prayers, and his prayers were very popular. They were circulated around. A lot of people used them as aids to pray, and also to meditate. He wrote a number of letters, hundreds of them, and he actually had his letters saved because he realized that these would be useful for other people to think about and to read later on down the line. He didn't write a memoir or anything like that, but this is almost sort of like saving stuff for your memoirs later on. And his letters reveal to us all different sides of his character. Sometimes he's the practical bishop who has to, keep the realm from falling apart, because it's always like one step away from that, and enforce, church discipline on these totally unruly monks, abbots, priests, priests that where he says stuff like, don't let that guy go into town, because when he does, he gets drunk and then he causes all sorts of problems. He wrote to a lot of noble people. He had family who he wrote to. He had fellow monks. He developed these friendships that are carried out, and then we know about them largely through epistolary relationships. So anyway, there's that whole corpus of letters. There is the Life of Saint Anselm by Eadmer, which I would say is great to supplement by the, again, the Dicta Anselmi, the sayings of Saint Anselm. I think that pretty much covers it as far as the whole gamut of stuff. And it takes a while to read your way through this, and it's stuff that you need to read through multiple times. I'm still rereading treatises that I've been reading for, some of them more than 10 years. And getting more and more out of them each time that I do. And that fits in very well with Anselm's conception of writing and thinking and what it is that human beings do with language, with reality that we're trying to grasp. So that gives you an overview of Anselm's works and kind of places them in the context of his time and his projects and his life. He didn't get to write everything that he wanted to. Towards the end of his life, he actually said to some of his fellow monks, I had meant to write this treatise on the origin of the soul, and I didn't get to it, and I don't think anybody else is going to be able to get to it now that I'm going to be gone. So that's kind of a fitting place to end. At this point in my career, and this has been going on for quite a while, a good portion of my scholarship is concerned with St. Anselm's thought and with digging into it and trying to, systematically study it, communicate it to other people, show how St. Anselm has something to say about a lot of the things that we're interested in. And that's been going on for quite some time for me. If you take my teaching out of the picture and my other work oriented in the same sort of things, my videos, all that out of the picture, a lot of my conference presentations, my academic writing, my projects are oriented around Saint Anselm. And how did that come to be? Well, that's kind of a long and tangled story, and I actually ended up having to sit down and kind of plot it out and figure out, well, how did I get from here to here to here to here? Because there's a number of different projects that culminated in articles or conference papers or things like that along the way. So it really starts back in 1998. So we're talking about 15 years ago. And in 1998, I had finished my master's. I wrote my master's thesis in continental philosophy on Husserl, and I was particularly interested in language. After abandoning a first abortive attempt to write on Wittgenstein in language, which I've talked about in my Wittgensteinian phase video. And I started reading Anselm in part because I'd gotten tired of reading Thomas Aquinas stylistically. Not in terms of his thought or the content of it, but I was working on my Latin, and when you're working on Latin, one thing that you have to do is, well, any language, you have to, read works in that language and accumulate vocabulary, and it's sort of like practicing and going on to an obstacle course. So I decided, look, I'm going to have to read this guy for... I'd read him before anyway, but never really paid much attention to him. I'm going to have to read him for my preliminary examinations. Let's dig into him. And by then I was kind of primed, because Thomas Aquinas, the experience of reading him in the Latin and just reading around, not just reading what was prescribed for this class or this class or this class, had shown me that my instructors... their take on Thomas Aquinas and his philosophy was dead wrong. That there was a lot more there than I had thought. That this Christian thinker who really centered his metaphysics and his moral theory around God, but incorporated a lot of philosophy, had a lot of interesting things to say, could anticipate a lot of the criticisms that would be made later on. So studying Thomas had kind of primed me for being able to take Anselm a bit more seriously. And I started reading the Proslogion. I got myself the Charles Worth facing page edition that had the Latin on one side and Charles Worth's sometimes faithful, sometimes not quite so faithful, translations on the other, along with Charles Worth's terrible, terrible commentary, which takes about half the book, where he devotes almost all of the commentary to the three chapters that are considered the ontological argument, and the rest of it he hardly discusses at all. But as I was reading it, I did find it more stylistically complex, and Anselm is very fond of using the chiastic structure as a way of arguing, and it's quite interesting what's going on in there. And once I started getting a feel for the language, I also started getting a feel for some of the concepts, and the fact that the way in which the concepts had been translated or were being discussed by other people were not often that faithful to Anselm's own text. So that started me, and then in 1999 I had to start preparing for my preliminary examinations. At Southern Illinois University, you took 4 preliminary examinations. Each was 3.5 hours. You had 3.5 hours to write essay answers to 4 questions selected out of a pool of 12, and each exam was focused on a particular area or set of areas in philosophy, and focused on a particular reading list. And the reading lists were immense. We had a pluralistic department. which meant that we had analytic, classical American, and continental philosophy, and a few history of philosophy people, and everybody tried to shove their stuff into that reading list as much as possible. And you could literally, you could be asked questions on anything in that reading list. So you had to, a lot of people tried to game, the system. I actually read everything on the reading lists. And not only read everything on the reading lists, studied just about everything on the reading lists. And so for the metaphysics and philosophy of religion one, Anselm's Proslogion was on there because, of course, the ontological argument is part of that. So as I was preparing and I was going through, I was studying not only for that, but also for the value fields exam at the same time. And, I was reading some of the same stuff that would show up in the epistemology, philosophy of science one later on. And I was also reading Hegel, too, because that was my special thinker. You had to have a special thinker exam. So I was reading a lot of the people who had addressed Anselm's argument, not just Anselm himself, but I was reading Thomas Aquinas. I was reading Descartes and, of course, Gassendi, his objections to Descartes' meditations. I was reading John Locke. I was reading Immanuel Kant. I was reading Hegel. And gradually this is interesting because there was a question that I answered on the exam, and it had to do with the ontological argument. And I traced out this sort of history of ontological arguments, starting with Anselm, and looking at Anselm and Ganilo's rejection of it, and then Thomas Aquinas' semi-rejection, because it was interesting. I learned from Thomas's commentary on the Psalms, which I was translating parts of and proofreading other people's translations of, that Thomas didn't really think that Anselm was wrong. He just thought that nobody's going to grant all the stuff that you need in order to get the argument going, but that Anselm was actually correct, strictly speaking. So we had three different, possibilities. Anselm, ontological argument works. Here it is. Ganillo, no, it doesn't work at all. It's terrible. Thomas Aquinas, well, yeah, it works, but there's better proofs. And then when we went to modern philosophy, we saw something similar. Descartes, Gassendi, John Locke. When we get to 18th, 19th century philosophy, we've got Kant as Ganillo, and Hegel sort of taking Anselm's position. So I included all of that in that question. And that would show up later on in the very first paper that I wrote for a conference. So that takes us up to 2000. And in 2000, fortunately for me, providentially, Anselm would say, there was a flyer on the bulletin board that had to do with conferences and events and things like that, and it said Saint Anselm, his legacy and influence, the first Saint Anselm conference at the Institute for Saint Anselm Studies, Saint Anselm College, Manchester, New Hampshire. And by then, this is actually before 2000. It was late 1999 when I saw that. I thought, well, I just answered a prelim question about that. I can write a paper about that. So I sent in a proposal, and it was accepted. And I was, still a graduate student at the time. I'd been to a few conferences, but not too many. And in the meantime, while I was getting ready for this, my last remaining parent died, and I had to handle the inheritance and all that. And so by the time that April rolled around, I had just barely gotten my paper written, and I flew out there to New Hampshire, and I was staying there, and it was a wonderful conference. There were people. First of all, there were people who were Catholics there. There were some Orthodox there. There were some Anglicans there because they're very interested in Anselm. There were some evangelicals there. Of course, there were some people who had no religious, connections whatsoever there. And I'm sure there were some atheists there as well, but they didn't make any big play of it there. And there were monks, because this was a monastery, and the monks were staying with their fellow monks at the monastery. And this is a very different world to me. I didn't grow up around that sort of thing, even though I grew up, sort of nominally Catholic as a kid. And, I heard some excellent papers. I got some good feedback on my paper. And then I met two people who would really influence my career as an Anselm scholar for the better. And they were both Benedictine monks. I actually credit both of them in a later piece that I wrote with my vocation. One of them is Father John Fortin, who is from that abbey, Saint Anselm's Abbey. His great love is actually, he's a medieval philosophy expert, but he also has a great love for international relations. He can talk all day long about that sort of stuff. Brilliant guy. Great organizer as well. And he was the first person in charge of the Saint Anselm Institute. So I got to talking with him, and he was very down to earth, and he was very encouraging, and he's a guy who, he has somewhat of a gruff exterior at times, but there's a lot of love in him. And I got to see that on many occasions. We became friends. And then there was Father Paschal Baumstein from Belmont Abbey down in North Carolina, and he was there with another monk because Father Paschal was not well. He had some brain problems that had required surgery at one point, and he wasn't, at that point, everything was kind of touch and go with him. So he had this other monk, Father John, who had accompanied him to just sort of help him out. And I talked with him a little bit at the reception. And then later on, I talked with him and Father John for a good hour at a breakfast at the hotel that we were staying at. And I learned all sorts of things that I didn't know about the Benedictine rule and about their way of life and about how this had influenced St. Anselm. And I didn't realize this at the time, but I was talking with somebody who was, in the top tier of Anselm scholars. Father Paschal is still. I mean, he's either in heaven or purgatory. Brilliant Anselm scholar who managed to really dig into certain aspects of Anselm's thought that other people just had kind of passed over. And Father Paschal and I would continue our conversations and through correspondence. And he became a very good friend of mine, and he sort of pushed me to keep reading this about Anselm, keep thinking about this on Anselm. He was very encouraging. So I met them there, and didn't do anything with that paper. They had a call for papers, but I didn't think it was good enough to actually submit. Then I went to the second St. Anselm conference in 2002, and I gave a paper. At that time I was writing my dissertation on Maurice Blondel, and Blondel had written a bit about Anselm and the ontological argument and about Descartes and Malebranche specifically. So I wrote this piece, which was later published in 2005 in the St. Anselm Journal. And I was in a panel basically about Anselm and Neoplatonism, and that gave me a lot of interesting things to think about as well. And then I started really reading Anselm seriously. The second conference had given me the idea there's a lot more to this guy than just this ontological argument. I better dig into this. So I started reading the Monologion and paying attention to that and seeing what wasn't contained in the Proslogion from the Monologion. And then I started reading the three, theological treatises that are supposed to pertain to the study of sacred scripture, but are really about moral life and the will and its structure and truth and, things like that. The on truth, on freedom of choice, and on the fall of the devil. And I was just being more and more drawn in. In 2004, I started writing a paper on something that had been underexplored in the Proslogion. Everyone wants to focus on the one single argument, which actually runs the whole of the Proslogion, and they think that it's Proslogion 2 through 4, the ontological argument about God's existence. Well, there's other stuff in there, and there's several chapters about how can God be merciful and just at the same time, which for me is a bigger conundrum than does God exist. And Anselm had a really ingenious way of describing and discussing and delving into this that requires, quite a bit of sort of mental gymnastics. And I don't mean that in the pejorative sense. I mean that in the laudatory sense. You have to really work your brain in order to dig your way into these kind of mysteries. And Anselm provided an apparatus, a structure for doing that in those chapters. So I wrote a piece on mercy and justice in Saint Anselm's Proslogion, and I thought, well, where should I send this? So I sent it to American Catholic Philosophical Quarterly, and they accepted it. And then it was published later on in 2006. I kept on reading and writing on Anselm, and in 2006 I gave a conference paper at the Indiana Philosophical Association, and it was centered on the question, what is actually St. Anselm's argument in the Proslogion? And it kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and eventually I've got to find something to do with this paper, because I've never published it. And it's grown perhaps too large to actually even be a journal article unless I send it to a European journal or to Philosophy and Phenomenological Research, one of these journals that accepts longer papers. But it is quite important, because what I'm doing is taking the best scholarship on Anselm. A lot of it has been overlooked here in the Anglo-American world, a lot of the French scholarship, especially reflexive philosophy, talking about Anselm, and trying to make sense out of what is actually going on here in this argument in Anselm's own terms. You have to think about what Anselm himself makes of argument, what he thinks language is doing, how truth is connected with ideas. So there was that, and then I also published another piece in the St. Anselm Journal that year in 2006. I was beginning to do the work that would eventually culminate in my book on the Christian philosophy debates, and I saw that Anselm was a figure who had been talked about in the Christian philosophy debates, and that the implications that were, the positions that were being taken had to do with whether Anselm's philosophy or thought was actually Christian philosophy or not. So I published St. Anselm's Fides Quaerens Intellectum as a model for Christian philosophy. And things started to really get moving at that point. 2007, I gave a paper entitled, rather cheekily, When Should Students Be Beaten? At the Midwest Medieval Historical, I think it's association or conference or society. It was a new field for me, talking to historians about this. And the paper had to do with Anselm's views on punishment and coercion. And by the way, Anselm's answer to when should students be beaten very, very rarely, as opposed to most of the people of his own time. And eventually I would have that published in Cistercian Studies Quarterly. They accepted it entirely with the one proviso that I had to change the title, because they didn't want, their journal is the kind that has the titles of the articles on it, and they didn't want people looking at it and saying, oh, so the Cistercians are about beating students. So that got published as another article. I gave a conference paper at the American Catholic Philosophical Association conference, which was focused on freedom and the will that year. Excellent conference. I gave a paper on Anselm, freedom, inclinations of the will, and moral virtue, that was published in the Proceedings. I got to meet Kate Rogers, which was something that was really an important thing for me. Kate Rogers still is a major Anselm scholar. She's got a recent book out on Anselm and freedom, several other books going back to her years, all the way back to her doctoral work at Notre Dame. So meeting her was sort of like meeting your favorite rock star. And again, a lot of these Anselm scholars, very down to earth people. We had some great conversations. And I've run into her again at several other conferences. 2007, I also did something else. I I saw that the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on Anselm was very short, and they were looking for somebody to write a longer article. So I said, well, I could do that. So I did it, and it was a long, lengthy writing process and then revision process and a lot of work. But eventually it culminated in this encyclopedia article that is getting used by a lot of people to learn about who this Anselm guy is and what his thought is. In 2008, one of the high points of my career took place, and it took place in part because of John Fortin inviting me out to Saint Anselm College to give the annual Saint Anselm lecture, which to me felt like kind of a leap of faith at the time. You know, who the hell am I? And he asked me to come out and give the talk on Saint Anselm that year. And so I did, and I decided I was going to take for my central theme God's simplicity and our complexity. So I gave this talk. It was about 45 minutes long. You can see it if you want. It's published in the Saint Anselm Journal, and there's a podcast of the talk and of my Q&A available on the Saint Anselm website, and I think I have links to it in my own blog website as well. So it was called, a simple God in our complicated moral lives. A perfectly simple God in our complicated moral lives. And it explored the nature of divine simplicity, the way that Anselm understands it, and then how that should affect us human beings. I also I moved down to Fayetteville that year, and in the I gave the paper in the North Carolina Religious Studies Association on Anselm, justice, and ontological dignity. Anselm is a Neoplatonist, and he distinguishes degrees of being, and I said that perhaps just being, should be understood as adding a greater amplitude or dignity, ontological dignity of being to the human being. Controversial thesis. Again, a paper I haven't done much with. I did send it out to one journal where it was rejected, but in a very weird way. They said it was a great paper, but they couldn't publish it at the time, and then they just left it at that, and it sort of fell through the cracks, and I didn't send it out anywhere else. 2009, I gave a couple more conference papers. One is Fides Quaerens Rectitudinus Intellectum, Christian Faith and Practical Rationality in Anselm. I gave that at the 4th St. Anselm Conference in 2009. 2009 was a very important year because that was the anniversary of a centennial, 900-year anniversary of Anselm's death. I gave another paper called The Personalist Aspect of St. Anselm's Neoplatonic Metaphysics at the Neoplatonism Conference in Steubenville, Ohio, at Franciscan University Steubenville. That was later published in their journal Quaestiones Disputate in 2011. I had a paper that was supposed to be published in a book that was going to come out in 2009 called Meeting God Through Moral Life, and it was about Anselm's moral theory and about how it would lead us to understanding God. How the practical and the theoretical come together. And John Fortin was editing that. And that was kind of an interesting turn of events because Notre Dame Press ended up, and this is a volume that had like the who's who of Anselm scholarship contributing to it. I was sort of riding their coattails in as a junior scholar. Notre Dame Press passed on it after all the essays had been written, and after things were supposed to like go to the presses, and so all of these papers just were kind of orphaned, hung out to dry. And I haven't done anything with mine. That's becoming a common theme. I'm realizing. Another thing that was really important for me was that in 2009, in the summer, I stayed for a portion of the summer as a resident scholar, being supported by the Institute for Saint Anselm Studies, and getting to do research in the library, the Geisel Library's Saint Anselm collection. I also was able to participate in the Metaphysics Colloquium, which is held at Saint Anselm as well. And that was a wonderful time. The backstory of that was I decided I wanted to write a book on Anselm and moral theory before I moved down to Fayetteville State University. So I was already beginning to work on it. And then at Fayetteville State University, they came up with these faculty development grants, and they said, hey, if you got a book project, something you're doing, we'll help you out with it. We want to help you, develop yourself as a scholar. Just write yourself a grant proposal and send it in. And so I did, and it was, it got accepted, but it was a huge, huge hassle. There were all sorts of headaches. I'm not going to go into the whole story, but let's just say there was a ton of mismanagement on FSU's part. Shortly after the money was starting to finally get dispersed, we went into a budget crisis, a massive budget crisis, and they started freezing things. And I have never seen grant money actually taken back, but that's what they did. They had agreed to, and they had promised that I would get money for travel to these conferences and for a stay up at Saint Anselm's. And I think I'd also written in there some study at Notre Dame as well. They took back all of that. So now I was like, well, I guess I'll just suck up the conferences, I'll have to pay for those myself because I'm not going to not go to the conferences. But what am I going to do about, this summer of study that I had planned to work on my book? And Dwayne Bruce stepped up. He was by now, John Fortin had moved on to a lot of other things, and Dwayne Bruce was now the head of the Institute. And Dwayne Bruce said, well, let me see what I can do to help out. And there was a lot of sort of finagling and making things work on a shoestring. And I got myself up there. I drove all the way up to Manchester, and they put me up in a dorm room and, made the library, available to me, hooked me up with the research librarian, gave me a card for making copies, said, whatever else you need, let us know. We can't actually give you board money, but here's a room that you can actually stay in, and you can get this work done. And so that was an invaluable time for me. It was a great outpouring of charity at a time in my life when things were in many respects particularly dark. I was teaching at a school that was just going through all sorts of problems, in a state that was going through all sorts of problems. My personal life was kind of a mess as well. And I was trying to get my scholarship back in gear after having had to jump ship from the prison job that I'd been teaching down to Fayetteville State University, only to find out that things were in such a mess there. So this was kind of an oasis for me to carry out some good scholarship, and I did. In 2010, I was contacted by Rhea Press and asked if I wanted to contribute to a volume called Death and Anti-Death, Volume 7, 900 Years After St. Anselm. And I thought, well, that's kind of weird stuff, and it was tied in with all this futurist, anti-death kind of things. But they had some pretty big name Anselm scholars. So I was like, well, okay. Seems like a forum where I could actually write some reasonable stuff on Saint Anselm and get it in there, and so I said, I'm going to do something on Saint Anselm and eternal life and human life, temporal life. I said, sure, sounds good. So I wrote something called Living Towards Eternal Life, Saint Anselm's Christian Anthropology. I also gave a paper at the Wisdom Conference in Wisconsin, back in my home state, Viterbo University up in La Crosse. I gave a paper on human and divine wisdom in Anselm of Canterbury, which I haven't done anything with. I suppose I really ought to. Then 2012, once I'd moved up here to New York, I gave a paper at the Felician Ethics Conference. What kind of moral theory does St. Anselm actually hold? Another paper I still have to do something with. I've promised it to their journal, actually, but I haven't revised it the way I ought to. And what was kind of interesting is that trip down there to Felician, which is in New Jersey, coincided with going further down into New Jersey because my wife and I were invited by Saint Anselm Parish to go as guests and give a dinner address. And so I did a little talk about who is Saint Anselm because they'd found out about me through my internet article, the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Saint Anselm, which, by the way, is if you put it into like a paper format, it's like 50 pages long. That's a pretty deep, long article. So anyway, that was kind of fun. I got to meet a lot of nice people who were quite interested in Anselm. We were going to do some talks, but then, of course, the hurricane hit and kind of put the kibosh on that, and they've been doing some rebuilding, but eventually I think we'll probably do that. And then I recently gave a paper, well, two papers, this year in 2013. One was in April, and it was at another conference at Franciscan University Steubenville that was oriented around the question, must morality be grounded upon God? And so I gave a paper called An Anselmian Grounding of Morality, where I said, yeah, for Anselm more or less, and here's how it would play itself out. That paper I'm actually revising for a very soon looming deadline for Quaestiones Disputate, where they want to publish the conference proceedings and papers, the ones that they particularly liked. And I recently gave another paper just this last month in Grand Valley State University, because that's where the International Society for McIntyre Inquiry was. It was called An Overlooked Medieval Occasion, Anselm on Justice, Virtues, and Vices in Moral Inquiry. It's quite a mouthful there. And it was basically saying, Alistair McIntyre has this great account of the history of philosophy and the history of moral theory. He talks about certain medievals, but he gives all this precedence to St. Thomas. He talks about Anselm a little bit, but really only in terms of the ontological argument. Here's how he could have talked about St. Anselm. Here's why St. Anselm was particularly important for medieval thought and could still be today. So it's quite a long discussion there about how I ended up getting into that. And hopefully you got an idea that, it's not just about conference papers or publications, but it's really about the content. Some of the things that I write about have to do with Anselm's argument and what's going on with that. A lot of things on his moral theory, including the book that I'm working on. Other things having to do with, time and eternity, or, other aspects of Anselm's thought, friendship, for example, the role that played. I got, the more and more that I research him, the more and more I'm finding things that I'm really drawn to in his thought. And so where my current projects are, a lot of those papers actually got written because I thought I was going to use them as chapters in the book that I'm writing. I was going to say supposed to be writing, but I am writing on St. Anselm's moral theory. I've got several chapters actually written, although they'll probably get revised as I finish other chapters. I'm also carrying out a project where I'm translating the De Similitudinibus. And later on, after I get that done, I'll translate the Dicta Anselmi, because I think these are works that really deserve to be out there and available to non-Latin readers. And then where I'm going to go after that, I don't know. I've submitted a few other conference paper proposals. One recently for a paper on Anselm and Heidegger, believe it or not, having to do with truth and nothingness. And I'll probably write on Anselm the rest of my life because there's so much stuff there that I just haven't yet explored. What I really need to do, besides getting my butt in gear about the book, is take a lot of these papers that I've written that haven't found a home yet and find them a home. Either what I need to do is get them into journals, which means actually going through the business of sending them out, and then what, if they get rejected, send them somewhere else. If they get accepted, it's usually you have to revise something, to fit their bill. So I got to get on with that, and either that or I need to pitch them as a book of essays, because I actually have enough unpublished Anselm essays that I could probably publish a whole book. The problem with that is I'm when it comes to Anselm studies, I would say that at this point in my career, I'm no longer a junior scholar, but I'm not in the, like the top tier of just big heavyweight Anselm scholars that, if you're going to do something on Anselm, you better bring these people in. I'm sort of in the middle ground. People who are interested in Anselm know my work. They may not know exactly what I'm doing, but I get a lot of good compliments on doing good scholarly Anselm writing and exploring interesting avenues in his thought. Sometimes I get from the reaction from people. Well, there's two interesting reactions I get from people. One is I had no idea this was in Anselm's work, because people don't always read as widely. And the other is, I'm really not sure I understand what you're talking about here. Are you sure that Anselm thinks that? And so I probably need to do a better job in making a case for that sort of thing. So that's probably a good place to close, go from the perfectly clear beginning to ending in mystery and ambiguity. I wanted to finish up this already pretty long video by showing you Saint Anselm's College, and in particular two places where I spent quite a bit of time during my summer stay there, and two places I like to go back to visit. So this is the patron of Saint Anselm College himself, Saint Anselm, a very dramatic statue of him. This is one of the places. This is the chapel. Interesting design to it, as you'll see in just a moment. Beautiful circular design, some really interesting stained glass. For me, this was a place where I could learn how to pray the Liturgy of the Hours by going there and doing so with the monks, which is something that I really got a lot out of. It was interesting seeing how slow, how meditative they were with it, and it helped me to better understand how that ought to be done. The other place where I spent a lot of my time in study was the Saint Anselm Collection, which is a room in the Geisel Library on the second floor, which is lined with these bookshelves containing volumes dealing with Saint Anselm, either about Saint Anselm or on Saint Anselm, or pursuing the scholarship further. They also have a lot of really interesting old volumes that I try to keep my hands off of, because I could probably, just damage them, and I don't have too much to get out of them myself. But I do consult a lot of the studies that are available, and I think younger scholars would find that very handy as well. The other thing that's really remarkable about this is that they gather all of the research as it comes out on Saint Anselm, and they categorize it and put it into these boxes. And that is what I really worked from a lot, and I think that's what younger scholars would find most interesting there. So that is my life as a Saint Anselm scholar.